Slavery, Politics, Power, and the Slow Collapse of Compromise. This episode takes us through the turbulent years when the United States began to buckle under its own contradictions, from the Wilmot Proviso to the Fugitive Slave Act, from the fires of bleeding Kansas to the chilling silence of the Dred Scott decision. We will meet new parties, old grudges, and voices that dared to shout when the country wanted to whisper. And at the center of it all, the impossible question: can a nation half free and half enslaved survive? Welcome back to US History Understanding This Country. If you are joining for the first time, I am so glad you found your way here. And if you have been walking this trail with me for a while now, thank you. You are the reason this journey continues. This isn't just a podcast about the past, it's about seeing today through the lens of what came before, understanding why we are the way we are, and what was paid to get us here. If these stories move you, teach you, or challenge you, please consider following, sharing, and rating the show wherever you are listening. And if you are tuning in on Fountain FM, well, a little sap goes a long way in helping me keep this fire burning. All right, deep breath, the storm is coming. Let's go back to the moment the cracks began to spread. If there is a moment that foreshadows the explosion to come, it's this one. A single sentence tucked inside a routine government bill that lit the match under the nation's most fragile fault line. In 1846, as the Mexican American War raged on and American forces seized vast territories in the Southwest, a congressman from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot stood up and offered what came to be known as the Wilmot Proviso. Quote unquote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of the territory acquired from Mexico. Simple, right? No slavery in the new land, but it landed like a cannon blast. You see, by this point, the US had a fragile balance between free states and slave states, like a table with legs just barely holding. Every new territory brought into the Union threatened to tilt that balance. The South saw the Wilmot Proviso not as a harmless proposal, but as an act of war, a direct assault on the institution of slavery and Southern political power. Supporters in the North, many of whom weren't abolitionists in the full sense, backed it not necessarily out of the moral conviction, but out of free soil ideology. The belief that white laborers shouldn't have to compete with enslaved labor. In other words, keep slavery out not to uplift black people, but to protect white farmers. And so, with a single proposal, David Wilmot tore the bandage off a festering wound. The proviso never became law, thanks to resistance in the Senate, but the damage was done. The lines were drawn north versus south, free labor versus slave labor, and from this point on, every debate over land became a proxy battle for the soul of the country. The Wilmot Proviso didn't start the Civil War, but it wrote its prologue, in ink still wet with tension. The year is 1848. The war with Mexico had just ended, and the United States had acquired vast new territories. The question loomed: would these lands permit slavery? The nation turned to the ballot box, seeking leadership in uncertain times. Three prominent figures weighed for the presidency: Zachary Taylor, a Whig and celebrated general from Mexican American War, known as Old Rough and Ready. Though a slaveholder, his political views were largely unknown. The second one was Louis Cass, the Democratic nominee who advocated for popular sovereignty, letting territories decide on slavery themselves. And the third one was Martin Van Buren, former president and Free Soil Party candidate. He stood firmly against the expansion of slavery into new territories. And the election results were as follows: Zachary Taylor from the Whig Party, he won 163 electoral votes and 47.3% of popular votes. Democratic Party's Louis Cass, he won 127 electoral votes and 42.5% of the popular vote. Whereas Free Soil candidate Martin Van Buren, he didn't win any electoral votes and just won 10.1% of the popular vote. Taylor's victory marked the last time a Whig would win the presidency. His ambiguous stance on slavery provided temporary solace, but the underlying tensions remained unresolved. The next big thing that happened was called the Compromise of 1850. But before we can fully understand the Compromise of 1850, we have to roll back a few decades to the year 1820 and take a look at what was at that time considered a brilliant act of political patchwork, the Missouri Compromise. The United States was growing, and with every new territory knocking on the Union's door, the same old tension echoed. Would it be a free state or a slave state? When Missouri applied for statehood in 1819, it wanted to join as a slave state, but that would have tipped the delicate balance in the Senate 11 free states to 11 slave states. The North was wary, the South was assertive, and Congress was cornered. Then came Henry Clay, known later as the Great Compromiser. He helped engineer a plan to hold the Union together just a little longer. The compromise was this: Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state. Maine, carved out of Massachusetts, would join as a free state. And here is the kicker: slavery would be banned in any new territories north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude line, the southern border of Missouri. It was a political band aid, and for the moment, it worked. But like most band aids, it didn't heal the wound underneath, it just covered it. Southerners accepted the deal, but they weren't happy about limits being placed on where slavery could expand. Northerners feared that the slavery was already spreading faster than freedom, and abolitionists they saw compromise as moral failure. The Missouri Compromise held the peace for about 30 years, a generation's worth of uneasy silence. But every mile west the country expanded made that silence harder to keep. And so when we return to 1850, we are no longer talking about the stable solution. We are talking about trying to fix a system that's already splitting apart. Let's move there now. The Compromise of 1850, a bigger, bolder, and far more fragile attempt to keep the Union from falling. The Compromise of 1850 wasn't a single law, it was a bundle of legislative bandages. Five separate bills stitched together in the halls of Congress, desperately trying to hold a country together with words. After the Mexican American War, the US found itself in possession of an enormous chunk of land, what we now know as the American Southwest, California, Utah, New Mexico, all part of the new spoils. But here is the catch: would slavery be allowed in these territories? Northern politicians feared a slave empire rising in the West. Southern leaders, on the other hand, warned that if they were blocked from bringing slavery to the new lands, they might just leave the Union altogether. And into the storm walked once again Henry Clay. Here is what the Compromise of 1850 did. California, it entered the Union as a free state. The slave trade, but not the slavery itself. The slave trade was abolished in Washington, D.C., a symbolic move. A new, stronger Fugitive Slave Act was passed. More on that soon. I have to talk about that. The Utah and New Mexico territories were allowed to decide the issue of slavery by popular sovereignty. That is, the settlers would vote. Texas gave up some land claims in exchange of $10 million in federal debt relief. It was literally a political gymnastics at its finest, balancing the seesaw just long enough to avoid a collapse. But while the compromise temporarily eased tensions in Congress, it inflamed the streets, especially the Fugitive Slave Act, a law so explosive it turned many Northerners from passive observers into active opponents of slavery. And that's where we are heading next, because while California was celebrating statehood, across the border, freedom itself was being hunted down in the North. California joined the Union in celebration. Gold in its rivers, freedom in its constitution. Something far darker was taking shape in the very same compromise. A deal had been struck, yes, but to win the support of the South, Congress handed over one of the most morally troubling pieces of legislation in the US history: the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This law didn't just tighten the rules, it rewrote the rules. It required citizens, even if free states, to help capture and return escaped enslaved people. If you were found assisting someone who had fled bondage, offering food, shelter, or even just silence, you could face fines or jail time. And if you were a free black person in the North, well, Now you had to prove your freedom in court without the right to speak on your own behalf. With just a claim from a slave catcher, your freedom could be stripped in an instant. Federal commissioners were paid $10 if they ruled someone was a slave and only $5 if they ruled otherwise. Justice, it seemed, had a price, and it wasn't on the side of freedom. The law turned quiet towns into hunting grounds. It dragged slavery's shadow into places that had once been safe. In cities like Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, people were torn from their homes, marched in chains through the streets. Some northern states tried to fight back with personal liberty laws. Churches and abolitionist groups set up resistance networks. And for many moderates, this was the moment when silence was no longer an option. Frederick Douglass said it best: the fugitive slave law makes mercy a crime and compassion a sin. The compromise of 1850 had promised peace, but this part of it, this Fugitive Slave Act, lit a fire in the North, a moral awakening that would not go quietly. And soon, very soon, the question wouldn't be, can the Union be preserved? But instead, at what cost? By now, the country was walking a tightrope of compromise, fragile, fraying, and doomed to snap. Every new territory raised the same question: would it be free or slave? And in 1854, Congress threw fuel straight into the fire with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This law, championed by Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas, proposed to organize the vast land of the Louisiana Purchase into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and let the people who settled there decide the fate of slavery themselves. It was called popular sovereignty. Sounds democratic, right? But here's the thing: this wasn't just any piece of land. These territories lay north of Missouri Compromise line, that imaginary boundary where slavery had been banned for more than 30 years. The Kansas Nebraska Act effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise, tossing that delicate agreement into the political trash bin. This wasn't about Kansas or Nebraska. It was about whether the nation had any real rules left or not. And people noticed really fast. Pro slavery and anti slavery settlers rushed into Kansas, each hoping to tip the vote. The territory became a powder keg, and it didn't take long for it to blow. Let's not sugarcoat it. Kansas literally bled. This wasn't just a political debate anymore. This was guerrilla war on American frontier. And it began right after the Kansas-Nebraska Act cracked open the door. Pro-slavery forces and anti-slavery settlers, sometimes called free soilers, flooded into Kansas, each determined to shape its destiny. At stake, whether Kansas would enter the Union as a slave state or a free one. But ballots weren't the only things being cast, bullets were too. In 1856, a pro slavery mob stormed the town of Lawrence, Kansas, a free soil stronghold. They smashed printing presses, looted stores, and burned the Free State Hotel to the ground. It was supposed to be a show of force. Instead, it became the moment the nation understood the fight over slavery had turned into open violence. This attack came to be known as the Sack of Lawrence, and it shocked many across the North. But the retaliation would be even more chilling. Just days later, a stern and wild eyed man named John Brown, a radical abolitionist, led a group of followers to Pottawatomie Creek. There, under cover of night, they dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their homes and hacked them to death with broadswords. John Brown believed slavery was a sin, and like many sins, he believed it would only end in blood. He called it righteous vengeance, but others called it terror. This was no longer a debate in Washington. This was war in wheat fields. Towns burned, families fled. Kansas wasn't just a territory anymore. It was a symbol of how badly the nation was coming undone. And while the fields of Kansas were soaked in blood, soon blood would spill inside the halls of Congress itself. Picture this: May 1857. The US Senate chamber, that place where words were supposed to win over war, becomes the site of brutal attack. Not outside, not on the frontier, right there, in the heart of American democracy. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, a fiery abolitionist, had just delivered a thunderous speech titled The Crime Against Kansas. In it, he condemned the violence in Kansas and called out the Southern politicians he believed had orchestrated it. That includes Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina. But Sumner didn't just challenge ideas, he mocked Butler personally, attacking his character, his speech, even his love for slavery. And the insult didn't sit quietly. A few days later, Butler's cousin, Representative Preston Brooks, also from South Carolina, walked into the Senate chamber. Without a word, he raised a heavy cane and savagely beat Charles Sumner over head and shoulders. Again and again and again, Sumner collapsed. His desk bolted to the floor beneath him. He nearly died. He would not return to the Senate for 3 years. But here is the real gut punch. Brooks was celebrated in the South. Supporters sent him new canes, some engraved with phrases like, "Hit him again." In the North, Sumner became a martyr. Blood had now been spilled, not just in Kansas, but inside the government itself. This was more than beating, it was a symbol of a country so divided that even the Senate floor, meant for reason, for law, had become a battlefield. As blood dried on the floor of Senate and smoke still curled above Kansas homesteads, the political landscape of the United States was reshaping itself, fast and furious. Old parties were crumbling, new ideas were taking root, and in 1856, a new political force stepped forward, born directly out of the chaos: the Republican Party. The Whig Party, once a major pillar of American politics, was all but dead. It had splintered under the pressure of slavery, unable to hold together its northern and southern factions. Into this vacuum came the Republicans, not conservatives as we think of them today, but a coalition of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and anti slavery Democrats who shared one core belief: slavery must not spread into the Western territories. They weren't calling for immediate abolition, at least not all of them. But they drew a hard line. The West should be free soil. That, they said, was not just politics, it was principle. Their first test came in election of 1856, and their candidate, John C. Fremont, a dashing explorer and military officer known as the Pathfinder. His campaign slogan captured the moment: free soil, free men, and Fremont. Fremont faced off against James Buchanan, the Democratic nominee, and Millard Fillmore, running under the Nativist American Party, also called as the Know Nothings. Buchanan won the presidency barely, but the Republicans had made a loud, undeniable debut. They won 11 free states and more than a third of national vote, without a single southern state in their column. That was the alarm bell. A party that didn't win the South, that didn't even try to win in the South, had just become a serious national contender. For Southern leaders, this wasn't just politics. It was a threat to their way of life, and they took it very seriously. Lines were hardening, parties were polarizing, and soon the courts would wane, not with justice, but with ruling that would shake the very foundation of American law. By 1857, the storm wasn't just brewing, it had struck right through the highest court in the land. This is the story of Dred Scott, a man who sued for his freedom and lost more than just his case. Dred Scott was an enslaved man. His owner had taken him from Missouri, a slave state, into Illinois and then to Wisconsin Territory, both free soil under Missouri Compromise. After years of living in those free lands, Scott believed he had earned his freedom. He sued. The case climbed all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. But in 1857, the court, led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, handed down the decision that didn't just affect Dred Scott, it shattered any hope of compromise between the North and South. The court ruled that Dred Scott was not a citizen and therefore had no rights to sue in federal court. But they didn't stop there. They went further, declaring that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in any US territory. That meant the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. That meant slavery could legally spread anywhere. And perhaps most chillingly, Tanner wrote that black people, enslaved or free, could never be citizens under Constitution. This ruling sent shockwaves through the North. It wasn't just a court opinion, it was a declaration that slavery was now protected everywhere the US flag flew. Northern abolitionists and moderates alike were horrified. The South, on the other hand, saw it as a vindication. For them, it meant that slavery was not just legal, it was a constitutional right. The Dred Scott decision was a turning point, not just in law but in national conscience. It erased any middle ground that remained, and it convinced many Northerners that slavery wasn't going to die a natural death. It would have to be fought. By the late 1850s, a new word had crept into the Northern vocabulary, a word that wasn't official but carried the weight of fear and accusation: slavocracy. This wasn't just about slavery anymore. It was about power: who had it, who was abusing it, and who might lose it next. Northerners increasingly believed that a pro slavery elite had seized control of the federal government, from Congress to White House to Supreme Court. And after the Dred Scott decision, it was hard to argue otherwise. They asked, if the court says slavery can go anywhere, if the president does nothing to stop it, if new states are being pressured to allow it, then who? Who really is running the country? This belief that a small group of wealthy southern plantation owners were pulling the strings fed into a rising northern paranoia, and it set the stage for one of the most famous political showdowns in American history. Enter Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. It was 1858, and Douglas, a Democratic senator from Illinois, was running for re election. Lincoln, relatively unknown outside of legal and Whig circles, challenged him, and what followed was a series of debates that weren't just about one Senate seat. They became a national referendum on the future of slavery in America. Douglas pushed popular sovereignty, the idea of each new state should vote for itself whether to allow slavery. It sounded democratic, but Lincoln saw the trap. In one of their fiercest exchanges, Lincoln warned, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He wasn't calling for immediate abolition, but he argued that America could not endure half slave and half free. It could have to become one or the other. And in a moment that made headlines across the nation, Lincoln pressed Douglas on whether a territory could legally exclude slavery, even after Dred Scott. Douglas answered yes, a response that saved him the Senate seat but lost him the South's trust. The Lincoln Douglas debates didn't make Lincoln a senator, but they made him a star. They gave the North a voice that could challenge the so called slavocracy, not with violence, but with logic, law, and moral clarity. And when 1860 arrived, it wasn't Douglas or Buchanan or any Southern figure who stood tallest. It was Lincoln, the man who said that compromise had run its course and that the nation had a choice to make. By 1859, the words were no longer just spoken, they were sharpened into actions. And at the center of that action stood a man with a wild beard, burning eyes, and a Bible in one hand, a rifle in the other. His name was John Brown. John Brown believed slavery was not just wrong, it was a sin that had to be washed away with blood. He had already made headlines with bleeding Kansas for violent attacks against pro slavery forces, but now he aimed bigger. In October 1859, Brown led a small band of men, black and white, into Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to ignite a slave revolt. His plan was seize the federal armory, arm enslaved people, and march through the South freeing as they went. But the rebellion never spread. Local militia and US Marines, led by Robert E. Lee, crushed the raid. Brown was captured, wounded, and quickly tried. At his trial, Brown didn't beg. He spoke with fire and faith. And when he was hanged, he died not as a criminal in Northern eyes, but as a martyr. Church bells rang in mourning across the North. The South, however, saw terror. If this is what Northern abolitionists now believe in, violent uprising, then they said secession might be the only way out. And just like that, the road to civil war lost its final turns. By 1860, the United States stood at precipice. Decades of sectional tensions, political compromises, and moral reckonings had brought the nation to a breaking point. The presidential election that year would not be only determining the next leader, but also the very fate of the Union. The political landscape was fractured. The Democratic Party, once a dominant force, had split along sectional lines. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen A. Douglas, a proponent of popular sovereignty, while Southern Democrats chose John C. Breckinridge, who advocated for federal protection of slavery in the territories. A new party, the Constitutional Union Party, emerged, nominating John Bell with a platform focusing solely on preserving the Union and the Constitution, deliberately sidestepping the slavery issue. In mid of this division, the relatively new Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln, a former congressman from Illinois. Lincoln's platform opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, a stance that resonated with many in the North but was anathema to the South. On November 6, 1860, Americans cast their vote in this deeply divided contest. The results were stark. Abraham Lincoln secured 180 electoral votes, winning nearly all of the northern states but received no electoral votes from the south. John C. Breckinridge garnered 72 electoral votes, dominating the southern states. John Bell captured 39 electoral votes, primarily from border states. Stephen A. Douglas, despite a significant popular vote tally, managed only 12 electoral votes, reflecting the fragmented nature of his support. Lincoln won the presidency with approximately 39.8% of the popular vote, a clear indication of the nation's deep divisions. Lincoln's election was perceived by many in the South as a direct threat to their way of life and the institution of slavery. The political center had not held, and the consequences would soon unfold in the most profound crisis the United States have ever faced. The news of Abraham Lincoln's election in November 1860 hit the southern states like a thunderclap. He hadn't carried a single southern state. In fact, in many places, his name hadn't even appeared in the ballot. To southern leaders, this wasn't just a political loss, it was an existential one. They feared Lincoln would move swiftly to abolish slavery, or worse, that he symbolized the northern majority that no longer cared to preserve their interests. Whether or not Lincoln intended to touch slavery where it already existed didn't matter. Perception had become reality. And for many Southerners, that reality meant one thing: they had to leave the Union. And so in December 1860, just weeks after the election, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the United States. Within weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed suit. These states saw themselves as sovereign entities, no longer bound by what they now call a broken compact with the North. To them, secession was not rebellion, it was a rightful withdrawal from the voluntary union that no longer protected their rights. They held conventions, passed secession ordinances, and began taking over federal forts, arsenals, and post offices within their borders. The North, meanwhile, was stunned. Many hoped naively that this was political theater, a bargaining tactics. But Southern leaders were already preparing for something far more permanent. This wasn't just political disagreement anymore. The Union, the idea of a single united American nation, was fracturing, and even those who had once supported compromise now began whispering words that had been avoided for decades: Civil War. By early 1861, what had once seemed unthinkable became official. The seceding southern states didn't just declare they were leaving the Union, they formed something new altogether: a new nation, a rival republic. In February 1861, delegates from the seceded states gathered in Montgomery, Alabama, and announced the formation of the Confederate States of America, commonly called the Confederacy. They adopted a constitution similar in many ways to the US Constitution, but with key differences. It explicitly protected slavery, guaranteed states' rights, and limited federal power even further. Their message was clear: this wasn't just a protest, This was a declaration of independence. They chose Jefferson Davis, a former US Senator from Mississippi and Secretary of War, as their president. Unlike Lincoln, Davis was no political outsider. He was a seasoned statesman respected in the South for his loyalty and military experience. A new capital was established, first in Montgomery and then later moved to Richmond, Virginia after that state also seceded. The Confederacy now included 11 states in total, stretching from Texas to Virginia, an expanse rich in agriculture, cotton, and enslaved labor. But the Confederacy faced enormous challenges from the start. It lacked a navy, a central banking system, international recognition, and even reliable infrastructure. But it had something powerful, a cause, at least in the minds of its leaders, preserving a way of life built around slavery, sovereignty, and Southern identity. And here was the tragedy unfolding. While the Union still hoped for reconciliation, the South was already building a government to stand on its own. Two flags, two presidents, two visions of what America was supposed to be. The political debate was over. The stage was now set for war. On March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood on the steps of the US Capitol facing a fractured nation. 7 states had already seceded. More were threatening to follow. Washington, D.C. itself sat uneasily between North and South. The air was thick with uncertainty. Lincoln's first inaugural address wasn't triumphant. It was pleading, it was careful, it was composed not with the tone of a conqueror, but with the heart of a man trying to stop a house from burning. He reminded the southern states that he had no intention to interfere with slavery where it already existed, that the Constitution, as it stood, gave them protections, that their fears were being stalked more by rumor than reality. But at the same time, Lincoln was clear secession was not legal and the Union must be preserved. The government would not initiate conflict, he said, but it would not shrink from defending its authority. And then came the closing words that still echo through American memory. Lincoln said, "We are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." It was a final appeal for unity, a hope that the ties of shared sacrifice, shared soil, shared memory might hold. But it would not be enough. 1 month later, cannons would roar at Fort Sumter, and the bloodiest war in American history would begin. This has been episode 23 of US History Understanding This Country. From the Wilmot Proviso to Lincoln's last plea for peace, we have walked through the final cracks in the Union's foundation. It has been a journey of debates, decisions, and division. And as we close, we now stand at the edge of the greatest crisis this country has ever known. In our next episode, we will enter the crucible of American Civil War. The causes, the battles, the leaders, the cause, and how it all reshaped what it meant to be United States. I know this was a longer episode. Thank you for listening. If this episode moved you, challenged you, or taught you something, please follow, rate, share the podcast. It keeps the story alive. I am Santosh, and this is US History Understanding This Country. Until next time, stay curious and take care.